So this was something that Fred Conley said of Father John Markoe. Fred Conley, former city councilman here in Omaha. So Fred said, he knew his own weaknesses and failings as well as any man. He looked directly at his own weakness and what he considered to be his wretchedness and unworthiness. And he came to love himself, not in spite of those weaknesses, but because of them. And I think he was able to do this because he permitted himself, as much as any man I've ever known, to permit God to love him. And I think it's the ability to let God love them conditionally, right and just as they are, that distinguishes the prophets from the rest of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Now I think we'll start with Angela Harden from St.Benedict de Moor. You want to go first? She and Elmer.
I just have a story to tell. I'm Angela Harden. I am a member of St.Benedict de Moor. Born and raised, that's the only parish I've ever known. My mother, my auntie, and my uncle are graduates of St.Benedict de Moor School. And my grandma had, not relations, but knew of Father John Markoe. But I'm here to tell you a story for Madwina Roach, who is a parishioner at St.Benedict de Moor. Her mother, Wanda O'Neill, had 8 children. And Father Markoe befriended their family. He was from Creighton, and he did a really remarkable thing of getting them into Catholic grade school as well as attending Catholic high school. And she said Father Markoe, she was really little at the time, so she doesn't personally remember him, but he would come to their house every Sunday. And they would talk, and he would do things for the family, would do things with their neighbors, and just really get to know their family. He has a really big influence on St.Benedict de Moor, and I'll let Omer talk more about that. But we have a Markoe room, which is a meeting area at St.Benedict de Moor, named after John Markoe. Madwina said that he would come and do weekly visits. They would come over. He would come to their house for dinner. He'd talk to all of the kids in the neighborhood and make them all feel welcome. He always walked the streets here on 24th, up and down the streets between Sacred Heart and Creighton, and he had a really instrumental part in the formation of St. Benedict de Moor coming to be. Madwina is now 80 years old, and she said her oldest sister is 92. So those are the memories that she has as far as that's concerned. And I'll turn it over to Elmer. That's for the video. Thank you.
Let me start off by saying, I don't know why I'm here. I really don't. Because this was the last place that I thought I would be at in this day. I'm driving about, and my car took me here. My car took me here. I know Matt. I know Matt's parents. And I know your parents have to be so proud of you right now, man. They are 2 examples of what Christians should be. Not only Christians, but what Catholics should be. That's how the influence they've had on you, and that influence that they had also is shared with me. Father Markoe was a very interesting person. I don't know how well liked he was to go to do because of the things that should happen. Back in the early 1900s, talking about black Catholics, there was just a handful of black Catholics. And the reason there was a handful of black Catholics because they had no place for them to worship in their faith. They started worshiping in houses, individual houses, as went from one Sunday to another Sunday. And then finally, they decided that just this one home would be the center for St. Benedict, the parish. It had to be Father Markoe telling the Jesuits what should happen, why it should happen, and it should happen now. And I think no one knows in St. Benedict's, but I think that's the reason why the St. Markoe, the Father Markoe room is named in his honor, because of the fact it was named in his honor after the day that St. Benedict's opened. So he had to be an integral part in St. Benedict's. And for that, I will always be grateful for. So, Matt, thank you. I'm here because of you. I want you to know how much love and respect I have for you. And that love and respect I have for you goes down to your parents also. So, goes up to your parents also. So, thank you. I'm leaving. I told you I was not supposed to be here.
Thank you very much, Helmut. Thank you. And now we have somebody in the room that actually knew Father Markoe. And I'd like to invite Father Andy Alexander to come forward and speak with us.
What is that? I suppose I'm here because I served Mass for Father Markoe among many other Jesuits when I was growing up in the mid to late 50s. And my memory of him was clear as could be. This was a tall man with the whitest hair you could imagine, who was stunning and powerful and dignified, and who stuck out enough for me to ask one of the Jesuits that used to come to our house frequently for dinner, "Who is that guy?" And he said, "Oh, that's Markoe. He works on civil rights." And I remember having no idea what those words meant, civil rights, and what he did. It was only much, much later when I entered the Jesuits and learned his story that he became an inspiration to me. Matt asked me to read the Jesuit part of this story to make sure all the information rhymes with what's supposed to be. And besides being overwhelmed by what a great writer Matt is, he did such research that we get to know Markoe because of documents and letters and comments and the story. I just want to say there's 4 things that are really important and last for me. That, excuse me, that vow that he and his brother took to dedicate their lives in service of the African American community was extraordinary for its time, then and now. Secondly, he was a broken man. There are many stories in the book that describe people commenting that hardly ever was there a more talented a person who failed more times. His alcoholism was a demon. And it becomes very clear that he put together the spirituality of the Jesuits from St. Ignatius, spiritual exercises, into life, because he was great not because he was great. He was great because he was humble. This man could identify with the poor. This man could identify with those who suffer, who knew rejection. Third, it's very clear that the impact he had on that De Moor society, including Matt's father, was that he said more clearly than anybody else was saying that racism is a sin. His activity was not political in an ideology sense. It was religious. Racism is a sin, and the discrimination that leads to it is what transformed his life and his dedication, and that's part of why he had such an impact on those students. His clarity was undaunted. And finally, the word that Matt uses in the subtitle, courage. As was suggested, he didn't always get the support that we would have hoped he had gotten along the way. But he had courage because of his background, I think. He turned his gifts in a direction that worked together. But ultimately, he was a man of faith, and his faith worked for him. He was unapologetic about what he believed and was convinced about. And to their credit, he got removed many times from different places. But somehow they left him here to do what he did with some constraints. But ultimately, he was able to be effective because he inspired people who didn't fully support what he was doing. That's how deeply this man witnessed his faith through the courage he lives. So as we read this book and are inspired by him, I imagine it will bring each of us closer to our own weaknesses and what ways those might help us be in solidarity with those who are weak, and ways in which we might grow in courage, imagining that we could do more than what's imaginable, and that we might continue to help our world, our church, one another, believe that racism is a sin.
And now the one that I think we're all anxious to hear from. Those of you that heard my homily this weekend, you hopefully saw that I believe there's a really strong connection between the Transfiguration and what we're celebrating today. This is a glimpse of the glory of God, how all of this comes together. Matt doing this research for 10 years, and then it comes out, his book comes out the very month that we begin this historic 24th Street family of parishes. It's only in God's design, right? So, and then Matt allowing us to gather together, as a humble man that he is, but gather together, celebrating the work but really the man behind the work that Matt did for all of us. So Matt, I just want to say thank you, because if it wasn't for your first book, I would not have known the connection that existed, the unfortunate, sinful connection that existed between Sacred Heart and St.Benedict de Moor when they were celebrating their 100th anniversary, and you worked with me to bring about that healing and reconciliation service to help the Sacred Heart parishioners understand that this is an unfortunate part of our history. And we wanted people who perhaps didn't know that story to become aware of that. I wouldn't have known that if it wasn't for you. And now you've done us this great service of giving us this spirit that unites us all together. So thank you. I'll have you put this on.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know what I can add to what was just shared by Patrick, Angela, Elmer, Father Alexander, and Father Dave. I will start with thank you for all of you for being here today. To know this story is being shared is the reason I wrote it. When Patrick told me this morning he couldn't stop reading but he had other stuff to do, that's why I wrote the book, is so the message of this amazing man would be out there for all of us. And the idea that I came to July of this year as the publication date was based on the fact I needed to come to a stop. My wife will agree, I love the research part, I love the writing part, and there's always another story to find, there's always some other sources to look at, and I said July of this year, Markoe died in July of 1967, that's my hard stop. I then became member of the transition team between St.Benedict de Moor and Sacred Heart, and the Archdiocese said this will go live on July 1. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. But I didn't quite, I knew, as we sat, and I really want to talk about the connections between the three parishes, which is the way I allowed Father Dave to talk me into doing this today, which is, as we sat and talked about what it would look like for these two parishes that had this chasm, 100-year gap of lack of trust and history of discrimination. How are we going to bridge that gap? We were doing it in the basement of St.Benedict de Moor, and behind me was the Markoe room. And I had to pinch myself a couple of times. I'm sitting here in the basement of St.Benedict de Moor next to the Markoe room talking about reconciling these two parishes that were so important to him and to my family. And then to add St. John's, where Markoe said Mass that was his home parish. Actually, St.Benedict de Moor was, on paper, St. John's was. The connections that Creighton has a building named after John Markoe Hall. There's a Markoe room at St.Benedict de Moor. Sacred Heart's connection is maybe a little less illustrious. The first place that the Poor's Club went to in 1947, under the direction of John Markoe, was to go to Sacred Heart Catholic Church and ask the pastor if they would allow any black students who had graduated 8th grade from St.Benedict de Moor. The answer wasn't a positive one. But Sacred Heart also has a connection in that there is a Denny Holland Award that is named after my father. That award would not be part of Sacred Heart if it wasn't for John Markoe, because my dad would not have done the things he did had he not met John Markoe as a 21-year-old Creighton student. So those three connections, the triangulation of those across the street, if you look at the beautiful building with the new glass front being built, that is the new Shirley Tyree Performing Arts Center. In 1950, it was the Ed Holmes Sherman Laundry, which was the very first business the Omaha Divorce Club boycotted, asking them to hire black employees since all of their customers were black. 3 blocks down on the right is the former home of the Omaha Divorce Center, which was their home when they were asked to leave Creighton University. About 4 blocks to the north is the former site of the Reed's Ice Cream, which is one of the places the DePorres Club picketed. Father Markoe lived on North 24th Street. He knew every person, every family, every business. Many of them were bars, and he knew the bars well. My dad remembers they would walk to 24th and Lake and then work their way back to Creighton, bar by bar. And yes, what Patrick read at the end of the book, he was humble because as he explained it to his brother, he had learned humility through humiliation. He had failed and failed and failed publicly and shamefully multiple times in his life. Yet he became a Jesuit priest in 1917. He was a Jesuit priest for 50 years. And I believe Father Dave mentioned to me that when someone told him that Father Markoe was an obedient Jesuit, Father Dave said, "I didn't see that coming." Because he was able to balance his activism with his vow of obedience. And I don't know how he did it, but he was, the old saying, you ask for forgiveness rather than permission, I think he used that on a regular basis. But his spirit it's in the building at St.Benedict de Moor. It's on the campus right next to St. John's. It's at Sacred Heart. And it is a lesson. We're having an event here in September with Creighton University, and part of that event is what are next steps? And I would honestly answer the next steps are that. The next steps are what John Markoe did. When he was held up after decades and decades and decades of working against headwinds, trying to make a change in the church, in Omaha, in society, and as he got older, people started saying, you're a prophet, you were so far ahead of your time. And he said, I don't know what the big deal is. This is a message that was shared over 2,000 years ago. He held that at his core, and as Father Alexander pointed out, his moral clarity. The reason the DePorres Club kept doing what they did for 7 years, making enemies, being labeled communists, was because he was able to convince them that this was a sin, even though the U.S. Catholic bishops didn't agree with that. This was a sin, it was immoral, and it needed to change. And when people like my dad would kind of waver on having to confront somebody, Markoe's response was, well, is it wrong? Then go tell them. He cut it to that quick, and I'll finish with a story that it kind of encompasses all of that. And my dad said Father Markoe would share it with the DePorres Club members, as my dad said, to help us understand what exactly we were trying to take on. And it's a story of a young Catholic woman who's working in downtown in a city somewhere in the United States. And she decides after she gets out of work, she's going to go to Mass at the nearby Catholic church in the downtown of that city. She happens to be a black Catholic. She walks up to the church, and she's greeted by the pastor, and he says, oh, my dear, we would love to have you, but you know, you have your own church. She decides she's going to turn around. She starts walking home, and Christ appears. And he puts his arm around her, and he says, don't worry, my dear. They won't let me in either. And my dad said, it was there, that's where you started. Where if you did that, that was your beginning point. And Markoe had the military background. He had been a trained cavalry officer. He had the bearing. He had the. One of my older brothers, I wasn't old enough to know Markoe. He died in '67. I would have been like 6. But I have 4 older brothers, and they remembered he had what Father Andy talked about, a presence, a charisma, who is that guy? And he used that to his benefit, but he didn't, because he was humble, he didn't look for credit. And one of the joys I had in writing this book was finding these stories that I knew he had been responsible for, and trying to ferret out where he came in. And you'd start to find connections with divorce club members or people at Creighton. He did so many things. The reason St. Benedict's is no longer a mission parish, for the longest time, St. Benedict's, for 40 years of its existence, there were no boundaries. The boundary was skin color. If you were a black Catholic and you lived in anywhere in Omaha, you had a parish regardless of your geographic location, and it was St. Benedict de Moor. And in 1954, I believe, Father Markoe wrote an unsigned editorial on the front of the Omaha Star. And I believe the headline said, St. Benedict's supporter of racial discrimination. And by the next spring, St. Benedict's was a standard parish with its own boundaries. He took, and again, as Patrick read, the quote from Fred Conley, he hated racism and he loved racists. He saw the church. Somebody asked me, why did he stay a priest for 50 years if the Catholic Church was so deeply institutionally racist? He would describe it as, that's not the church. Those are people. The church is at its core aside from what the people are doing. And he believed that. He acted on it. He lived it. And Father Dave and I were having lunch the other day talking about this, and you had someone that asked you to be their spiritual advisor. And I said, I have a spiritual advisor. It's John Markoe. In the 10 years of writing this book, it has been a spiritual journey for me of understanding what it is to be faithful, what it is to be humble, what it is to be a Catholic. And my hope is that in reading this book, I can start, in writing this book and having people read it, I can start to have some amount of that courage of challenging anything, but specifically the history of race in the Archdiocese of Omaha and in the greater Catholic Church. Thank you. And it's 2 o'clock.
So Matt was humble enough to just say that he wants that courage, but I'm going to go ahead and extend that to all of us, especially as we begin this journey of the historic 24th Street family of parishes, that we all strive to allow the spirit of Father John Markoe to enliven within us the courage to continue to bring awareness to and change in our society, in our city, in our church, in the face of racism that still exists, unfortunately, today. So let us allow that to bind us together, to give us the courage to speak out when and wherever it is needed. Thank you all very much. You're welcome. We got the place until 3 o'clock, but you don't feel free to continue to make those friendships. And if you came in and did not receive a book, please make sure that you get a book, and yeah, enjoy.
Where are they on sale at?
The books are available at the Bookworm here in Omaha and also on Amazon. Do we have any questions?
Does anybody have any other questions? Thank you for that. Not for me, of course, but for Matt.
That's good.
Here we go.
Oh. Where did I get the sources? My dad had most of them. He had collected all of the Divorce Club and Markoe materials. And Google. All right, thank you.